When we think of World War I, we picture trenches, machine guns, and artillery. But there was another, more insidious conflict happening. They called it the Chemist's War. For the very first time, science and industry were weaponized to create entirely new forms of mass destruction, poisons that could be unleashed from a simple canister. So let's dive into this dark and terrifying chapter of modern warfare.
But before we get into the science and the strategy, let's just start right here, with the words of the soldier-poet Wilfred Owen. This isn't some dry, abstract history, you know? This was the raw, terrifying reality for millions of soldiers. A horror so completely overwhelming that it would haunt their dreams for the rest of their lives.
So, how on earth did the world get to this point? Why would anyone turn to such a horrific new weapon in the first place? Well, the answer lies buried in the mud and the sheer misery of the trenches.
You see, by the end of 1914, the Western Front had completely bogged down. Millions of men were dug into this huge, static network of trenches that stretched all the way from the Swiss border to the North Sea. And with machine guns and modern artillery, the defender had this massive advantage. Any attack was basically a suicide mission. It was just a bloody, brutal stalemate.
This was the question that obsessed every single commander. How do you break through? They needed a weapon that could just drift across no man's land, seep down into the enemy trenches, and take out the defenders without a huge frontal assault. A silent, invisible killer that didn't care about barbed wire or machine guns. And in poison gas, they thought they'd found their answer.
Now, the first few attempts to use gas were, well, they were almost comically ineffective. But in less than a year, things escalated. Chemical warfare went from being a minor irritant to a weapon of mass casualties that would change warfare forever. Just look at how fast this all happened. In August of 1914, the French use a tear gas. The Germans barely even notice. The Germans try their own irritant shells. The concentration is too low. They try again with a massive barrage in the dead of winter, and the chemical literally freezes. It was all trial and error. But then, on April 22, 1915, at the Second Battle of Ypres, everything changes. This was different. This was big. At Ypres, German forces opened up thousands of cylinders, releasing 167 tons of chlorine gas. It was heavier than air, so it formed this terrifying gray-green fog that just rolled across no man's land and poured right into the Allied trenches. This was the world's first large-scale poison gas attack. The effect was immediate, and it was absolute chaos. The French and Algerian troops in that sector had no idea what was hitting them. They were blinded, choking, completely terrified, so they broke and they ran. And it tore a massive 8,000-yard gap in the Allied front. But here's the crazy part. The German infantry were also kind of freaked out by this strange new weapon, and they advanced so cautiously that they didn't really capitalize on the breakthrough. The attack worked, but it also triggered immediate global outrage.
Well, the genie was out of the bottle. The attack at Ypres didn't end the war. Not even close. It just opened up a new, terrifying dimension. And what came next was this vicious, deadly arms race.
This became the grim rhythm of the Chemist's War. It was this terrible cat-and-mouse game. One side develops a deadlier gas. It causes horrific casualties. Then the other side scrambles to invent a defense. And as soon as they do, the chemists go right back to the lab to create something even worse.
And you can see the escalation right here. Chlorine was awful, but it had weaknesses, right? It was a visible green cloud, it had a strong smell, a simple damp cloth could actually give you some protection. So the next step was phosgene. And phosgene was a whole new level of nasty. It was colorless, it smelled faintly of moldy hay so it was hard to detect, and it was way deadlier. But here's the truly insidious part. The symptoms could be delayed for up to 24 hours. A soldier could breathe it in, feel totally fine, and then drop dead the next day as his lungs filled with fluid.
So of course, the technology of protection had to evolve at this breakneck pace. At first, it was just desperate measures. Soldiers were literally told to urinate on a cloth and hold it to their face. Then came simple pads, then these primitive hoods called smoke helmets. But the real game changer was the small box respirator. It was a proper mask with a filter canister, and it actually worked. In fact, it was so essential for survival that soldiers said they would abandon their rifles before they'd ever abandon their respirators. That tells you everything.
But just when it seemed like the defense might have finally caught up with the offense, the Germans introduced something new in 1917. An agent that wasn't just designed to kill the enemy. It was designed to make the battlefield itself a toxic, uninhabitable weapon.
This new weapon was mustard gas,
And it was what's called a vesicant, or a blistering agent. Basically, its whole purpose wasn't just to choke you, but to burn you, to maim you, to cause as much pain as possible.
See, unlike chlorine or phosgene, mustard gas wasn't even really a gas. It was this oily liquid that would just settle on the ground, in the mud, on equipment, and it would stay potent for days, even weeks. It attacked any part of the body it touched. It caused these massive, horrific blisters. It stripped the lining from your lungs, and the death it caused, my God, it was a slow, agonizing process that could take 4 or 5 weeks. A respirator could save your lungs, sure, but it couldn't protect your skin from the contaminated ground.
And if you want to understand that suffering, just listen to the words of Nurse Vera Britton. This was a slow, torturous breakdown of the human body, happening right in front of helpless doctors and nurses. It was a special kind of hell.
By the end of the war, gas was a standard weapon, but it never again really gave anyone that decisive breakthrough they were looking for. Instead, its main legacy was just one of unimaginable suffering and a universal horror that would go on to shape international law for the next 100 years.
And a human cost, it's just staggering. Let that number sink in for a second. 1.3 million casualties. While the number of deaths from gas was sometimes lower than from artillery, it maimed and scarred an entire generation.
If you look at the breakdown by country, it's really revealing. Just look at Russia. Over 400,000 casualties, 56,000 deaths. They suffered far more than any other nation. And that's largely because the troops on the massive Eastern Front were often poorly equipped and had much less effective gas masks.
And the wounds weren't just physical. The constant threat of a silent, invisible killer created this unique and constant terror. Gas shock became just as common as shell shock, a deep, pervasive dread that stayed with soldiers long, long after the war was over.
The sheer horror of gas warfare led directly to this landmark moment in history. In 1925, the world's nations came together to sign the Geneva Protocol. Now here's the crucial part. It banned the use of chemical weapons in war. But it didn't ban countries from making them or stockpiling them. And that limitation, well, that would have consequences down the road.
But the message, for the time, was crystal clear. The experience of the trenches had created this powerful global taboo. As the protocol itself said, these weapons had been justly condemned by the general opinion of the civilized world. The international community drew a line in the sand.
And that's the legacy of the Chemist's War. It's this fragile promise born from the memory of that green sea of gas at Ypres and the agonized whispers of mustard gas victims. It's a promise that's been tested many times since, and it forces us to keep asking the question, is the horror of the past enough to prevent it from ever happening again?